every one of those renewable energy projects needs off-takers for both the power and the environmental attributes. And there was a wide range of corporations in the market that were looking to mitigate their scope 2 emissions and seeking out new and higher impact clean energy options. But that marketplace is fragmented and over the counter and lots of emails and phone calls. Probably the biggest thing that I didn't fully understand was really qualifying the company's true commitment versus their published commitment. The more look at us, look how great we are, the less likely they're to actually be doing really good, important things. The more kind of humble they are about it and kind of rooted and grounded in like steady as you go progress, it's like, okay, we're making our progress here. Spend an enormous amount of time falling in love with the problem that you're interested in solving. Really go deep on it. There's a high probability that whatever solution you think is the one is not right.
Hi, Scott. Thank you very much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Zettawatts, your company?
Sure. So I'm Scott. I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. I've started a whole bunch of different companies over the last 30 years. Probably the most well-known, I was the founding chief technology officer for Priceline.com. If you're from Europe, you might know it as Booking.com, and spent the last several decades building a wide range of different companies. I've worked in global public health as the CEO of Malaria No More, chair of Network for Good that distributes about $500 million a year to 250,000 different charities around the United States. And about 3 years ago, decided to spend more time focused on broadly sustainability and looking at how the next several hundred years was going to play out. And in the first instance, figuring out how we were going to reduce our carbon emissions, and energy seemed like a good place for me to spend some time. And so specifically clean energy, we're going to talk more about that. And then I also recognize that we're going to have to adapt to an uncertain future, and electrifying everything and more distributed electricity and more renewable and carbon-free electricity was going to have to be part of that solution. So that's what Zettawatts has set out to do. In its first instance, focused on how do we scale up more renewable energy projects. And our observation was that every one of those renewable energy projects needs off-takers for both the power and the environmental attributes, and that there was a wide range of corporations in the market that were looking to mitigate their scope 2 emissions and seeking out new and higher impact clean energy options. But that marketplace is fragmented and over the counter and lots of emails and phone calls. And so we think there's an opportunity for technology to play a role there.
Was there like a particular moment or insight that told you this was the solution for you? Or was it more of a gradual process?
So in the very beginning, I read a book by John Doerr called Speed and Scale, which essentially unpacks using objectives and key results, which is a business tool for setting goals and managing against them. And it kind of deconstructed the SBTI curve. So if you're familiar with that net zero curve, it sort of took apart, not just for a single company, but for like the planet, what are all the things that we need to do? And what struck me was that electrifying everything was going to be a critical part of the path, and then scaling up the energy infrastructure, and particularly carbon-free electricity infrastructure. So that's what got my mind turning, was saying, all right, well, there's an opportunity there. Let's start where I live, which is in the United States, kind of scope it to how do we get more renewable energy projects built? And the first question I asked was, why aren't we already building much, much faster than we are? Like what's in the way? And so I spent about a year talking to everybody that had many, many decades of experience in the clean energy space, really trying to understand on the developer side of the equation, what were their biggest hangups? And there are a lot of them. Everything from the way the interconnection queues are managed so that you can connect projects to the grid, to the way the tax incentives are structured and different types of mechanisms for basically attracting the most capital into the projects, and understanding how everything from tax equity, which is a very novel structure to get access to various types of tax credits for developers, to how permitting and not in my backyard local issues navigate things. But while each project is kind of a snowflake in those different dimensions, every one of them needs to find an off-taker. And what intrigued me was that offtake, or really a buyer of the electricity at the base, they needed to make a commitment for 10, 15, 20 years. And that struck me as unusual. There aren't that many places in commerce where you're making a really long-term commitment like that. You might sign a commercial real estate lease that's 10 years long. So I was like, well, who are the off takers? And so the insight that I had was there's utilities, and there's lots of markets in the United States where the utilities have mandates to purchase more clean electricity. And so that those mechanisms in those markets are driving some adoption, although it is still slow. But the other side of it was the corporate off takers. And the reality is that those corporations, very few of them are actually trying to get at the underlying electricity. What they really have is an emissions problem. So what they're trying to figure out is, I use electricity, let's say all over the country, office space, maybe light manufacturing. And while I procure my electricity from the local utility for a 2-year, sometimes a 1 or 2 year term period, my emissions that are a result of using that electricity, that is viewed through a market footprint, like the whole country. And what do I do about that? And the different mechanisms that were in place struck me as overly complicated for what was an emissions problem, not an electricity problem. And so that was kind of, if I had an aha moment, it was, okay, you've got these project developers, they need off takers in order to get their financing to develop their projects. Corporations need an easier way to mitigate or abate their emissions from electricity that they're already going to procure and use. They don't really have a choice. So how might we collapse that and make it a lot easier?
What is it you feel most companies get wrong when trying to take these sustainability goals and turning them into actual action?
I think for a lot of good reasons, the market around sustainability developed as the first thing we need to do is to figure out what our actual emissions are. So a large part of the current sustainability market is built around accounting. How do we count for the different types of things? And to the credit of everyone who's developed them, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and Science-Based Targets Initiative, there's good language around what's a scope 1 emission, what's a scope 2 emission, what's a scope 3 emission, how do we account for that? And most of the action, the mitigation that's been taking place makes sense in it. It started with, well, what do I control in that scope 1 world? How do I mitigate? And that could be everything from, if I own the building, figuring out how to just reduce my overall electricity use, right? A megawatt hour that didn't get used has the lowest emissions of anything. So that makes sense to me. I think the challenge is, I think when people started to get into scope 2, they started to realize that it was more complicated. The solution providers really weren't as robust, and the level of impact started to get called into question. If I buy an unbundled renewable energy certificate or an environmental attribute certificate, depending on what part of the market you're in, I'm going to call them RECs for the purpose of our discussion, renewable energy certificates. If I buy those independently of the power that I bought from a project that was built 10 years ago, whoever owns that project today is harvesting that capital as part of their operations. None of that money is going to build a new project. And the marginal value of a renewable energy certificate to a project developer is de minimis in comparison to the power price itself. So most developers, they want to sell their environmental attributes, but when they only have a value of 50 cents, let's say, or $1 compared to a 40 or 50 or $60 price of power, nobody's building a new project because of those renewable energy certificates that they might sell in the future to a voluntary buyer from a corporate standpoint. So there's a mismatch between the value that the developers were putting on those renewable energy certificates and then the impact that they were having from a mitigation perspective as a corporation. The corporation saying, I actually want to bring new projects on, but the only tool I have is to buy RECs from projects that got built in the past. Like, how do I do that? And so the innovation that came out over the last probably like a decade or so was the virtual power purchase agreement that allowed a corporation to participate more directly in being an off-taker for both the power and the environmental attributes. And they could get what we call additionality as a result of that. So, and I'll come back to additionality in a moment, but their idea was, all right, maybe we can participate in bringing new generation online, even though we have this distributed use of electricity around the country. If we participate in buying the electricity and the environmental attributes from a project, then we can get access to participating in those projects coming online. The nature of a virtual power purchase agreement, though, is complicated. They're technically swap agreements, which means you need to do mark to market against them. They're derivatives. So, simply put, I set a price, a strike price for the buying the power. And if the power price in the wholesale market is higher, I get to keep the difference as the corporation. But if it's lower, I have to pay the difference. We're in a very volatile electricity market in most of the wholesale markets in the United States. So I'm taking on all that risk. Now I've got to find somebody to hedge the power. It's just endlessly complicated, long agreements, a decade or more of a commitment, and it's just too complex. So if you want to participate in bringing new generation online, what you're really trying to do is to get at just the environmental attributes. And so that was what we invented, which we call an additionality rec. It's a renewable energy certificate, the same as everybody else. It's managed the same in the registries and all. The big difference is you're putting a contract in place in advance of the development as an off-taker, typically at a premium. You're paying a fixed price premium for those renewable energy certificates, making them more valuable as a relative to the overall project offtake for the power. It might be $8, $10, $12 a megawatt hour. The corporation now has a very simple agreement that they can put in place. Still long term, but it's at a fixed price. They know exactly what it's going to cost them. There's no market volatility on the power. And the developer, who's an expert in developing projects and understands the electricity market, they can either find an alternative off-taker like a utility or a small cooperative, or they can sell the power directly into the merchant market, into the wholesale market, and they are the ones that are managing the price volatility, and they're more likely to be experts, or the operators that take over the projects once they're built are experts in that. So that's kind of the dynamic around this market, but I mean, even just explaining it to you, it's unbelievably complicated. And
Hmm.
if you're a sustainability leader who's got 50 things going on and you're trying to figure out this one, right? And it's a big piece, scope two. Your scope two emissions are like the largest that are semi in your control. And then scope three, all of your supply chain or others emissions, a big part of their emissions are scope two. So you really have to figure out your electricity strategy from a mitigation perspective. And it's not easy.
Taking a little bit of a higher level look at it, then, do you feel it's a case of, because the scope one emissions are fairly controllable, like they're within a business's locus of control, whereas scope two and scope three are a bit outside of that. Do you feel it's taking so long for businesses to make these changes because scope two and scope three feel more complex or feel more out of their control? Or do you feel it's more on the side of actually they didn't realize how much work and how much resource and money they'd have to put into fixing these? So once they get to scope two and scope three, there isn't as much appetite for it.
I do think that there's a budget challenge where in scope one, they sold the idea that we can actually save money by implementing efficiencies. I think when you get to scope two, it's an investment that you're making. And I think that's the first place where companies are running up against the idea like that this is actually an investment that we're making in order to essentially clean up our use of electricity. We don't have a choice. We're using electricity right now. It's not like we can choose, but where we source that electricity from or how we participate in decarbonizing the grid is a choice, but it is an investment. And I think if there was a mistake that's happened with unbundled RECs is that they became a low cost, high marketing value trade. For a couple of dollars a megawatt hour, I could buy a bunch of renewable energy certificates covering all my historic load for the last year, and I could claim 100% clean energy as part of my reporting. I don't begrudge anybody who did that, but the challenge is now as you start to move into the greenhouse gas protocol and SBTI, and large corporations saying, well, that's not good enough. Now you're ratcheting it up, and now that couple of dollars is now looking more like 10. That's a much bigger budget line item for a lot of companies. And so I think the sustainability leaders are trying to navigate, how do we still have the impact that we want, but there's a real cost to it. And the reality is that even at $10, if you're buying retail electricity in most of America, you're probably paying anywhere from $120 to $200 a megawatt hour of electricity. So to spend an extra 10 is really not $10 is really not a major cost structure, right? It's a relatively small percentage. And even within, for most service businesses, which is most of the businesses in America, a large accounting firm or a law firm or a software development company, or they're not looking at their electricity bill as like the major cost center that they need to manage. It's a tiny thing, but it's hard to think about because the budget comes from the sustainability leader. And the sustainability leaders are going, well, we use 10,000 megawatt hours a year. Now I got to spend $100,000 a year to buy a high impact, like an additionality rec. That's a lot. That's a lot of money for them, even though they spend, $2 million a year on electricity, right? So like that $100,000 a year is not it's a small thing compared to what they spend on electricity, but it's the sustainability leaders budget is like they're themselves, maybe one other person. And that $100,000 a year is like, that's a lot of money. So there's a budget piece. And then I think the other challenge is making the case, like, why do we have to do this? If you don't have executive buy-in on it. We're about to release a research study that we did called Greening the Grid. And the whole idea was talking to sustainability leaders about what are the barriers to them taking action specifically within scope 2. And budget and executive buy-in. Those are kind of the two big themes, right? Not surprising. And then the last piece is, okay, now you want to go do it. And it's hard. It's complicated. You got to go to the CFO and say, I'd like you to sign, in my example, $1 million contract for the next 10 years. Like, it's only $100,000 a year, but we got to sign $1 million commitment. That's a big deal. So, and we've made it smaller with additionality recs. It would be, could be a 25 or $30 million commitment or more if you're doing a virtual power purchase agreement, for example. So it's not easy to make change around this, and there's no financial ROI. It is a cost center. And so you've got to have all these things aligned to get to that place.
So you mentioned, it's mostly about simplifying market access for both the corporate and the developer side. Where's the biggest friction today for you?
I think that the corporate demand around their prioritization of clean energy, understanding what their current options are, and then understanding what a simpler alternative can get them. Those are the challenges. Is an education piece of understanding what's available to me and then what's it going to cost. There's also an incentive structure issue. If I'm a corporation and I have a set of voluntary goals, and let's say they've even committed to a net zero target with SBTI, I've got to choose where and when I'm going to take certain actions along the way and get budget to do those things. And so the scope 2 piece in clean energy has to show up as the next thing on my list. What has changed in a positive way is that there are more and more corporations that are starting to set expectations, not just for themselves, but for their supply chain. Microsoft, as a big buyer, they've said to their supply chain, you need to get in line with this. So as the incentive structures become more clear and put more pressure on it, it makes our life a little bit easier to still have to educate, but then make the sale. On the developer side, they need off takers, right? So they're looking to figure out how to make their projects pencil, and each project really is its own challenge, right? Like a lot of the mechanics are the same, but at the end of the day, you can't skip any steps. And so not every project is going to be a good fit for something like an additionality rec. So we need to find and identify those developers with those projects that are a good fit. But there's, I don't know, 2.5 terawatts of projects that are in the interconnection queues around the United States. That's not going to be the bottleneck. It's more complicated now, the IRA in the United States and the questions around tariffs. And there's some uncertainty and chaos in this moment, but I think everybody expects that it'll pass over the next 6 to 12 months and we'll understand what that new dynamic is. So anyway, I would say the customer side and the corporate side is much more an important challenge than the developer component of it.
You mentioned that education piece there. How is it you're thinking about trust and education on both sides of the platform? Because, well, is it more that you're trying to approach that through the messaging and the marketing that you're doing? Is it more in terms of, I guess, one-to-one networking, contacts, speaking to people in person? How are you thinking about that?
Right now, the maturity of the market is limited. So most of it is one-to-one kind of conversations and explanation with good materials out there to explain the basics of what's going on. But at this stage, again, these kinds of agreements, nobody's going to go in cold and sign a 10-year agreement, right? They're going to want to talk to somebody once they've done their kind of research and committed to things, made their commitment to, all right, we're going to go do something. Then, as I said earlier, they want to understand what the budget is. What is this going to cost me to do this? And again, it's not that they're trying to parse $100,000, $120,000, or $80,000. It's they're living in a world where it was $10,000. They want to understand that, hey, look, it's probably 10 times as expensive, 5 times as expensive. What does that look like for me? And then making the case for that piece of the puzzle. And we're continually developing new presentations and tools and processes to help those sustainability leaders bring their colleagues along, typically in finance, in legal. And so we're often find ourselves meeting with multiple people. I think of this kind of a sale as a multiplayer mode on the sustainability leader side. They've got to coordinate multiple. We've been on meetings where there's 8 people have shown up. There's somebody from procurement. There's somebody from facilities. There's somebody from legal. There's somebody from finance. And they all want to understand sort of what they're getting into and what the implications are. So, that's not unusual for an enterprise sale, but that's kind of the state of things. So as much as I would love for us to produce, the world's most perfect, video series or, documentation, everybody feels like they need to understand this in a deep way. And so it's just easier right now to have those conversations. I do think that will change over time as more of the standards get applied, where it's no longer a choice about doing something high impact. It's which high impact thing am I going to do? Because that's a different question, right? So I think as that happens over the next few years, it's going to change the dynamic of both the education, because now it's why should you do this high impact thing? And then how do you do it? I think if we eliminate that first part, which is probably half the conversation, the second half becomes a lot more straightforward.
I mean, enterprise sales is always about getting lots of different people involved because it is going to affect different people. So, for example, like an ERP will affect different functions, different systems. And I guess in that scenario, an ERP or most enterprise software is there to help them do their job better, help their workflows become more efficient. With something like this, it is very much a cost center that mitigates risk over the next couple of decades. Is there anything you've learned from other enterprise sales that you're trying to bring into this process, or something that you've liked that you would like to bring in?
I think that understanding how to simplify the product configuration, so the choices that you need to make, and then all of the contracting. So we have standard agreements that are mirrored between us and our corporate customer and Zettawatts and the developer, and they're reciprocal effectively. So it makes it a lot simpler to have a standard contract that everybody can read ahead of time and say, okay, do I want to do this or not? So truly productizing this, it really should be more like a commodity. The way the market has developed, it's been treated as a bespoke thing for everybody. And that takes longer. It's more complicated. And so I think what we're bringing is more standardized agreements. If you were to look at buying an ERP system today or any kind of enterprise software, even the tools that we use in our day to day, we're not negotiating a special contract component to these things, right? You might negotiate some of the commercial terms, right? Could be pricing, could be the time to pay, but those are around the edges, right? The core agreements are the same. And so that's probably the biggest thing we've brought to this is working to commoditize at least this slice of it so that it becomes much, much simpler for everybody involved. And then you can focus on what is probably the most important thing from a corporation standpoint is how do I get a handle on cost, right? What's this going to
Mm.
cost me to do this high impact thing? And the more it's, again, commodity like, the easier it is to make that decision because it's like, okay, this is the price, right? I understand what this is versus on the developer side, it can have a lot of variability and that's okay because they can handle that variability. They're navigating each project on its own. But from the customer's perspective, you really like to abstract that chaos away and make it much, much simpler. And so I think that's where we're playing it. So the last piece I'll say is the innovation in enterprise, let's say in software, moving to the cloud meant that I didn't have this big complicated install where I had to go and understand all your existing systems and put hardware in your office. It's stripped away and abstracted all that away and just says, look, yeah, there's no provisioning. It's all in the cloud. So we want to do that same kind of thing here.
What surprised you most about building Zettawatts compared to your past ventures?
The overall complexity of the electricity market reminds me a little of small villages that turned into big towns that then turn into big cities. And you say, you look at the road infrastructure around them and you go, why are there roads this way? Right? Like, why does this road go through the middle of all these buildings? It doesn't make any sense. It sure made sense 200, 300, 500 years ago, but here we are, we're living with it, right? So the electricity system is pretty similar. It was very much an organic kind of grew up in pockets and got connected up to each other. And so the actual physics of the way the electricity system itself works, the expectations around reliability and sort of always available. I expect 100% uptime and I expect 100% of no matter what I connect up to it, the grid has to serve it. So just the way it operates is complicated. And then you're introducing this new factor in both renewable energy, intermittent sources, battery technologies. Like we're throwing a whole bunch of stuff at this infrastructure that is new and different, and we're learning how to navigate it. It's the right thing to do, but that level of complexity is really, really high. And I've worked in the travel space. I worked in other types of energy. They're complicated, but they're not as complicated, and they're not as important from an infrastructure standpoint, right? If everybody's flights are delayed for even a day, that affects that local population of people whose flights were affected today. If there's a blackout across the entire East Coast of America, that affects everybody in America for that time period. So just the level of risk and the complexity there is just much, much higher.
What's one thing you wish more sustainability founders knew about or understood about commercial growth?
I think that probably the biggest thing that I didn't fully understand was really qualifying the company's true commitment versus their published commitment. So we poured through lots of sustainability reports for looking at years of, yeah, we're bought into these things, right? And so it's actually more of an anti-pattern. It's kind of nuts. The more look at us, look how great we are, the less likely they're to actually be doing really good, important things. The more kind of humble they are about it and kind of rooted and grounded in like steady as you go progress, the more likely they are to be in a place over a 5-year period, let's say, where they started at 0 and they ended up at 7%. Okay, we're making our progress here. We might not make it, it might take us longer than we expected, but we're making progress, every year. So I think that we probably spent about a year really knocking on the wrong doors and thinking that the sustainability leaders we were talking to had really the juice, the commitment internally to actually get the thing done. I think what we found was that there were a much smaller set of sustainability leaders that we're enabled and empowered by the larger enterprise to go get this stuff done. Real commitment. And by the way, it doesn't have to have budget. We've talked to sustainability leaders that are, they're one of two people in their team and that have made huge progress over things because their enterprise had real commitment. So figuring out how to suss that out, I don't have any tricks to it other than I noticed an anti-pattern. So it's like, all right, go for the ones that are probably more humble about what they're doing. I find conferences to be almost worthless in this space right now, not because you can't meet really cool and interesting people, but because it's almost everybody are still in the accounting realm, and a very small percentage of them are doing the harder, real mitigation work. Again, buying unbundled RECs for electricity is fine. It doesn't actually change anything about the grid. If it's those very small group that are actually doing the hard work, whether it's making the decision to use something like additionality RECs, or it's going and doing the complicated things like a power purchase agreement or a virtual power purchase agreement. But doing that hard work is the work. Getting the budget is the work. And so figuring out the signals for those sustainability leaders that really have their corporate buy-in is probably the biggest single thing, and it's a big challenge.
The anti-pattern's funny. It's like how the loudest person in the room is usually the most insecure one in the room.
Yeah, look, it's like anything, it's not perfect. That doesn't mean that there aren't companies that are doing a lot of really important work and talking about it, but my own antenna go up when it's like, look how great we are. What did you actually do here? Right? What did you actually do here?
My final question for you before we finish up is if you had one piece of advice in general for another founder in sustainability, what would it be?
Spend an enormous amount of time falling in love with the problem that you're interested in solving. Really go deep on it. There's a high probability that whatever solution you think is the one is not right. It's more likely that it's wrong, that you've got the wrong solution. But if you really go deep on the problem, then as you're evaluating your first solution against that problem, it'll be more obvious to you that you've got a miss, and what do you need to adjust in order to address it. You're constantly learning more about the problem itself, and don't let that go. That you can be persistent over long periods of time at understanding and solving problems. It's very hard to be persistent with the wrong solution because you tend to just be banging your head against the wall. So you have to be willing to let go of those solutions, but not let go of the problem. And I think that when you look at successful entrepreneurs, that's the thing that they hold dear, is the problem, whether they express it that way or not, and less so about the idea of the solution that they cooked up. That's why the stories of companies that pivoted, we were going this way and we went this way, they sound like, oh, look how brave you were. But if you look under the hood, it's we had the wrong solution to a problem, or we didn't really love the problem. And so we went and solved a different problem. But like either way, the problem had to change somehow. And my approach to the problem had to change, either new problem or existing problem, with abandon the solution and get after it. So that's my key advice, not just for sustainability founders, but really anybody who's starting a company where there's a lot of unknowns. Really reduce the problem set down to its core and fall in love with the problem.
I think the interesting side effect of that as well is when you go deep on the problem, you start to understand the market a lot more. And when you understand the market a lot more, that's how you get to product market fit rather than trying to force the solution on people when they don't want it. Um, yeah, I like that. Thank you. How can people find out more about Zettawatts, possibly get involved, get in touch?
Sure. Well, you can visit zettawatts.com, zettawatts.com. You can book time with me if you're interested in learning more about anything that we're working on. We are pretty active on LinkedIn, and so we're constantly kind of updating our view of the market. So you can learn more there as well.
Scott, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you.